The tiny outcast. Neri walked through the grand halls of the Phyloxian city, her small feet barely making a sound on the polished stone floor. Towering structures surrounded her, built for beings much larger, much stronger than her. Every time she looked up, she felt even smaller. The Phyloxians were a proud warrior race, their strength defining their status in society. But Neri? She was only 4 feet tall, the smallest of her kind. She had grown up hearing the same words over and over again. You're too small. You're too weak. You'll never be chosen. The other females in her community were tall and powerful, their thick limbs and broad shoulders proving their worth. But Neri, she was nothing like them. As she passed by a group of Phyloxian warriors, they barely acknowledged her presence. One of them, a male named Grusk, smirked when he noticed her. "Look, it's the little one again," he said, his deep voice filled with amusement. "Still dreaming of being something more, Neri?" The others chuckled, and Neri clenched her fists. She had learned long ago that arguing wouldn't change anything. She wasn't strong enough to fight them, wasn't big enough to command respect. Instead, she simply lowered her gaze and walked past them. But deep down, the words still hurt. Neri had spent years proving that strength wasn't everything. She was intelligent, quick, and resourceful. While the warriors focused on brute force, she studied history, technology, and the lost knowledge of their ancestors. But on a planet where power ruled, intelligence was easily ignored. She sighed and made her way toward the city's outer gates. Outside the city walls, the land stretched far and wide, filled with rocky terrain and old ruins from a forgotten time. It was one of the few places where she felt at peace, far away from judging eyes. But today, something was different. A large silver ship had landed near the ruins. Its surface gleamed under the twin suns, and several tall figures stood near it. They weren't Phyloxian. They were humans. Neri's heart skipped a beat. She had heard of humans before, but she had never seen one in person. They were strange creatures, taller than her, but smaller than the average Phyloxian warrior. Unlike her people, who had thick, rough skin, humans were softer, their features more delicate. They were known for their adaptability, their intelligence, and their strange ways of thinking. Curiosity burned inside her. What were they doing here? She stepped closer, staying behind a large rock as she watched them. There were 5 of them, all wearing dark uniforms. One of them stood out, a male with short brown hair and sharp blue eyes. He wasn't the biggest among them, but something about him seemed different. Then, to her surprise, he turned his head and looked right at her. Neri's breath caught. She hadn't expected to be noticed so quickly. Most Phyloxians ignored her. Why would a human be any different? The man smiled slightly and said something to the others. Then, without hesitation, he started walking toward her. Panic rushed through Neri's veins. She shouldn't be here. The humans were guests, and she had no reason to be spying on them. But before she could slip away, the human was already standing a few feet from her. "You don't have to hide," he said, his voice calm and friendly. Neri hesitated. His words were strange, lacking the deep, growling tone of her people. But there was no mockery in his voice, no amusement, just curiosity. She swallowed and slowly stepped out from behind the rock. The human took a moment to look at her, really look at her. Most Phyloxians barely glanced at her before dismissing her. But this human, he seemed to see more. "I'm Jake," he introduced himself. "And you are?" Neri hesitated for only a moment before answering. "Neri." Jake nodded. "Nice to meet you, Neri." She blinked. No one had ever said that to her before. Then, another voice called from behind him. "Jake, stop talking to the locals and get back to work." Jake sighed but didn't take his eyes off Neri. "I'll see you around," he said before turning away. Neri stood frozen as he walked back toward the other humans. Her mind raced with questions. Why had he spoken to her like that? Why hadn't he laughed at her size? And why did her chest feel warm all of a sudden? As she watched him go, she realized something. For the first time in her life, someone had seen her, not her size, not her weakness, just her. And for the first time, she wanted to know more. The first encounter. Neri's heart was still pounding as she watched Jake walk away. She had met many aliens in her life, but none had looked at her like that before, like she was someone worth noticing. She clenched her hands into fists, confused by the strange feeling inside her chest. It wasn't fear. It wasn't embarrassment. It was something else. She should leave. She knew that. The humans were here for official business. She had no reason to be anywhere near them. But her feet refused to move. Instead, she found herself following them from a distance. Jake and his team were setting up some sort of scanning equipment near the ruins. They were speaking in their own language, but Neri recognized the devices. They were using deep field scanners to map underground structures. She frowned. Those ruins were ancient. Many believed they held secrets from the early days of the Phyloxian civilization. But her people never cared about history. They only cared about power and war. If the humans were interested in the ruins, it meant they knew something the Phyloxians didn't. And Neri wanted to know too. She took a deep breath, gathering her courage, and stepped forward. "What are you looking for?" she asked. Jake turned, his blue eyes lighting up with surprise. "You again," he said with a small smile. The other humans glanced at her, some curious, others indifferent. One of them, a tall woman with dark hair, muttered, "More locals." But Jake didn't ignore her. He didn't dismiss her. Instead, he answered, "We're scanning for underground tunnels," he said. "These ruins might be connected to an ancient network. If we find a path below, we might discover something important." Neri's eyes widened. He was right. She had read about such tunnels in old records, but no one ever cared enough to investigate. "You're looking in the wrong place," she said before she could stop herself. The humans exchanged glances. Jake tilted his head. "Oh, and where should we be looking?" Neri hesitated. She wasn't supposed to talk to outsiders about Phyloxian history, but her own people didn't care about her knowledge. What did she have to lose? She pointed toward a rocky area a few meters away. "There, the ground is weaker in that section. If there are tunnels, they'll be deeper under the surface." Jake turned to his team. "Shift the scanners," he ordered. The other humans hesitated but obeyed. They repositioned the scanners to the area Neri pointed to. A few seconds later, their screens flickered. Jake's eyebrows shot up. "She's right." A murmur passed through the team. The scanners detected a large underground chamber. Neri felt a strange mix of pride and nervousness. She had been dismissed all her life. But now, in front of these outsiders, she had proven her knowledge was real. Jake looked at her with something different in his eyes now. Respect. "How did you know that?" he asked. Neri swallowed. "I'd read about it. Studied old maps. I've always been interested in the ruins." Jake chuckled. "Looks like you know more than the people running this planet." Neri bit her lip, unsure how to respond. But before she could say anything, a deep, growling voice echoed from behind her. "You shouldn't be here, Neri." Her stomach dropped. She turned to see Grusk, the warrior who mocked her earlier, standing with two other Phyloxians. His massive frame made her feel even smaller than usual. The human stiffened at his sudden arrival. Jake folded his arms. "And you are?" Grusk ignored him, his yellow eyes locked on Neri. "You have no right to speak about our ruins with outsiders. You are nothing." Neri. Small. Weak. Neri flinched. She had heard those words before, but this time, with Jake and his team watching, the sting was worse. Jake's expression darkened. He took a step forward, standing between Neri and Grusk. "I don't know what kind of society you run here, but where I come from, knowledge and intelligence matter more than size." The other Phyloxians growled. Grusk sneered. "You think you understand our ways, human." Jake didn't back down. "No, but I know a fool when I see one." Silence fell over the area. Neri's eyes widened. No one had ever stood up for her like this before. Grusk clenched his fists, but he didn't attack. Not yet. Stay away from them. Neri, he spat. You don't belong with outsiders. With that, he turned and walked away, his warriors following him. Neri let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Her hands were shaking. Jake turned to her, concern in his eyes. You okay? She nodded, but she wasn't sure if she was. Everything was happening too fast. Jake studied her for a moment before grinning. I like you, Neri. You've got guts. Her heart skipped. What did that mean? Before she could process it, Jake turned back to the scanners. All right, let's get digging. Neri watched him work, her thoughts racing. For the first time in her life, someone saw her as more than just a weakling. And for the first time, she wanted to prove them right. A heart too big to ignore. Neri had never felt so alive. For years, she had spent her days trying to be invisible, avoiding the ridicule of her people. But now a group of humans were listening to her, respecting her. And Jake was defending her. It was an unfamiliar, almost overwhelming feeling. She stood at a distance, watching as the humans set up their excavation equipment. The scanners had confirmed the existence of an underground chamber, just like she had suspected. Now, the humans were preparing to dig. Jake moved with purpose, checking the readings on his wrist device. Every now and then, he glanced in her direction and smiled. Neri didn't know why, but every time he did, her chest felt tight. She had never had someone look at her like that before. Not with mockery, not with pity, but with interest. She shook her head, trying to push those thoughts away. Humans were strange. Jake had no reason to see her as anything other than another alien on this planet. She was probably imagining things. But still, she stayed. The excavation site was busy. The humans used their high-tech drilling machines, but Neri knew the Thyloxian ground well. It was unstable. Digging too aggressively could cause a collapse. She stepped forward. You're doing it wrong. A human scientist, an older man with graying hair, looked at her in surprise. Excuse me. Neri pointed at the rocky surface. The soil here isn't strong enough to handle heavy drilling. If you use too much force, the ground will give way. You need to reinforce the sides first. The scientist frowned, skeptical. But before he could dismiss her, Jake spoke up. She's right, he said. I read that Thyloxian terrain can be tricky. Maybe we should take her advice. The scientist sighed but nodded. Fine. We'll reinforce first. Neri's heart raced. He believed her. Again. She wasn't used to this. The Thyloxians never cared what she had to say. And now, suddenly, a human, a stranger, was standing up for her. Thanks, she said quietly. Jake smirked. You're sharp. I like that. There it was again, that strange warmth inside her. She didn't understand it. Why did his words make her feel special? She turned away, her cheeks burning. A secret beneath the earth. Hours passed, and the humans worked carefully, following Neri's advice. The excavation was going smoothly, until the ground shook violently. A rumble spread through the site, and the humans stumbled as dust and debris fell from above. Jake's voice rang out. Everyone, back. The shaking intensified. Cracks spread across the ground, and before Neri could react, the earth beneath her collapsed. She felt herself falling. The world spun, dust blinding her vision. Then, pain. She hit something solid, and everything went dark. Trapped below. When Neri opened her eyes, she was in total darkness. She coughed, dust filling her lungs. She was alive, but trapped. A groan echoed nearby. She turned her head and froze. Jake was lying a few feet away, pinned under a heavy slab of stone. Panic surged through her. Jake. He grunted, trying to move, but the rock was too heavy. Neri, you okay? She crawled toward him, her small hands brushing away the dust. Yes, I think so. Jake chuckled weakly. Well, that makes one of us. She didn't hesitate. She had spent her life thinking she was weak. But now, someone needed her. Neri pressed her hands against the rock and pushed. It didn't budge. She was too small, too light. But she refused to give up. Jake watched her struggle, his expression unreadable. Neri, it's too heavy. You should. I'm not leaving you, she snapped, surprising herself. Jake blinked. Then, slowly, a soft smile crossed his lips. All right, let's do this together. Neri nodded, determination burning in her chest. She examined the rock, searching for a weak point. Then she remembered. Leverage. Jake, she said, push against this side when I say go. He nodded, adjusting his position. She wedged a small, jagged rock beneath the slab and used it as a lever. Then, with all her strength, she pushed. Now. Jake heaved. For a second, nothing happened. Then, the rock shifted. With a final effort, Jake pulled himself free, rolling onto his back, gasping for breath. Neri collapsed beside him, exhausted. A moment passed in silence. Then, Jake started laughing. Neri stared at him. Have you lost your mind? Jake grinned. You saved my life. Neri. She blinked. I did. Jake sat up and looked at her with something new in his eyes. Yeah, you did. Her heart pounded. She had always thought her small size made her weak. But today, she had proved herself wrong. And Jake saw her strength, a feeling she didn't understand. They were still trapped below, but Neri's mind was somewhere else. For years, she had wanted to be seen. She had wanted someone to look past her size, past her weakness, and see who she really was. And now, Jake, the human explorer, the outsider, the strange alien who had no reason to care about her, was looking at her like she mattered. She had no idea what this feeling inside her was. But for the first time in her life, she didn't feel small. She felt big, and that terrified her. Trapped underground. Dust still hung in the air, thick and suffocating. Neri's lungs burned with each breath as she sat beside Jake in the darkness of the collapsed chamber. Her small frame trembled, not from fear, but from the weight of what had just happened. She had saved him. A human. A stranger who had stepped into her world and somehow seen her in a way no one else ever had. But they weren't out of danger yet. Jake groaned as he tried to move, wincing as he pressed a hand against his side. Neri frowned, her large amber eyes narrowing. You're hurt. Jake let out a small chuckle. Yeah, I figured that out when I tried to breathe. Neri bit her lip, her mind racing. It was too dark to see how bad the injury was. But from the way he was breathing, shallow, careful, he was either bruised or worse. Broken ribs. Her heart pounded. She couldn't lose him. She had only just begun to understand what it felt like to be important to someone. I need to check, she said, her voice softer now. Hold still. Jake let out a dramatic sigh, but didn't resist as Neri scooted closer. Her hands, small but steady, ran over his torso. She could feel the rise and fall of his chest, the warmth of his skin through his torn uniform. A strange, unfamiliar heat rushed to her face. She ignored it. Her fingers pressed lightly against his ribs. Jake flinched. Broken, she whispered. Jake let out a slow breath. Great, that's just what I needed today. Neri glanced around the chamber. The dust was beginning to settle, but the air was still thick with the smell of earth and stone. She traced her fingers over the uneven walls, feeling the texture of ancient carvings. This place was old, older than anyone on her planet had ever recorded. And now, they were stuck here. How deep do you think we are? Jake asked, watching her as she examined the walls. Neri thought for a moment. At least 30 feet, maybe more. Jake let out a low whistle. That's a lot of rock between us and fresh air. They were trapped. No one knew if they were alive. And no one would come looking for her. For him, maybe. For her, never. The chamber of the forgotten. Neri shook off the dark thought. She had always relied on herself, and she wasn't going to stop now. We need to find another way out, she said. Jake raised an eyebrow. You got a plan, short stuff. Her eyes flickered toward him, her expression serious. I might be small, but I know these ruins better than anyone. Jake grinned, wincing slightly as he shifted. Didn't say it was a bad thing. Neri stared at him for a long moment. No one had ever said her size was good before. No one had ever looked at her like being small meant something useful. She turned away before she could let that thought settle in her mind. Her hands traced over the walls again. The carvings, they weren't just random symbols. They were directions. A path. A way out. Neri. Jake's voice was quieter now, almost careful. You okay? She exhaled. I found something. Jake forced himself to stand, using the wall for support. Neri moved to his side, guiding his fingers over the rough stone. These symbols, they tell a story. But look here. She pointed to an etching of a long, winding tunnel. This isn't just a carving. It's a map. Jake's eyes widened. You mean there's a way out? Neri nodded. If this map is right, there's another exit. But, she hesitated. But, Neri swallowed. It's far. Jake smirked. Good thing I've got you to guide me. Something in her chest tightened. Why was he like this? Why wasn't he like the others? She turned away quickly. Come on, we need to move. The long journey through darkness. They moved slowly, Neri leading the way through the underground tunnels. The air was damp, filled with the smell of stone, dust, and history. Every step echoed in the narrow corridor. The path was tight, barely wide enough for a Thyloxian warrior to fit through. But for Neri, it was perfect. She fit where no one else could. For the first time, her size wasn't a weakness. It was an advantage. Jake followed behind her, breathing heavily. She could hear the strain in his voice every time he made a sound. He was in pain, but he never complained. Her chest ached. She stopped suddenly. We need to rest. Jake leaned against the wall, exhaustion in his posture. You sure? Neri crossed her arms. If you pass out, I can't carry you. Jake chuckled, then winced. Fair point. They sat in silence for a moment. The dim glow of Neri's wristlight cast flickering shadows on the walls. Then, Jake spoke. You're not like the others. Neri's heart stumbled. What do you mean? Jake's blue eyes locked onto hers. Back up there. Your people looked at you like you didn't belong. Neri looked away. I don't. Jake's voice was quiet but firm. They're idiots. She let out a small laugh. You don't even know me. Jake smiled. I know enough. Silence stretched between them. Neri could feel something shifting inside her, something she didn't understand. Finally, she stood. Come on. We still have a long way to go. Jake pushed himself up. Lead the way, small but mighty. Neri rolled her eyes. But she didn't hide her smile. They walked deeper into the unknown, neither realizing that this journey wasn't just about survival. It was about something bigger. Something Neri wasn't ready to admit yet. But her heart already knew. Love in the air, or is it just a misunderstanding? Neri led the way through the narrow tunnels, her mind swirling with thoughts she couldn't quite explain. The walls were damp, the scent of ancient stone filling the air. Every few steps, she glanced back at Jake, watching him carefully. His breathing was uneven, strained. His injury was slowing him down. Her heart clenched. She shouldn't care this much. He was just a human, a stranger, someone who had accidentally stepped into her world. And yet, every time she heard him wince, every time she saw the flicker of pain in his eyes, something inside her hurt. We need to stop, she said abruptly. Jake chuckled weakly. You're the boss. She wasn't. She never had been. But with him, it felt like she was leading for the first time. She helped him lower himself onto a flat rock, ignoring the way his body tensed when she accidentally touched his side. Here, she handed him her water supply. Jake gave her a grateful nod, taking a slow sip. Thanks, short stuff. Neri narrowed her eyes. Don't call me that. Jake smirked. Why not? It suits you. She huffed, crossing her arms. It makes me sound small. His smirk softened into something gentler. You are small. Her face burned. She opened her mouth to snap back at him, but before she could, he leaned forward slightly, his expression thoughtful. But you don't feel small. Neri's heart stuttered. She didn't understand this. She had spent her entire life hating her size. Being called weak, overlooked, ignored. And yet, when Jake said it, it didn't sound like an insult. It sounded like something else. Something that made her want to be seen by him. I don't get you, human, she muttered, looking away. Jake let out a soft laugh. Join the club. A growing problem. They had to keep moving. The tunnel stretched endlessly, twisting and turning through ancient rock. Neri followed the old map carved into the walls, guiding them forward. Jake was stubbornly keeping pace with her, but Neri could see it. The exhaustion, the pain, the way his breaths came shallower each time they stopped. He was pushing himself too hard. She slowed her pace, pretending to study the wall markings. Jake raised an eyebrow. Why are we stopping? Neri didn't meet his gaze. Just making sure we're on the right path. He frowned but didn't question it. She knew what he was thinking. He didn't want to be a burden. But he wasn't. If anything, he was the first person who made her feel like she was more than her size. And she wasn't going to let him collapse just to prove something. A different kind of battle. As they walked, Neri found herself stealing glances at him more often. She didn't mean to. It just happened. The way his muscles tensed when he moved. The way his blue eyes flickered with quiet determination. The way his voice, deep, steady, made her stomach feel strange. She shook her head. Focus, Neri. But she couldn't stop the thought from creeping in. Would Jake have looked at her this way if she were like the other Thyloxians? Tall, strong. Would he ever see her as something more? Her chest tightened at the thought. And then, her ears twitched. Something was ahead. She grabbed Jake's arm instinctively. Wait. Jake immediately tensed. What is it? She listened. The faintest sound echoed through the tunnel. A soft, rhythmic dripping. Water. She exhaled in relief. A fresh water source. Jake smirked. Perfect. I was just thinking about how much I love not dying of dehydration. Neri rolled her eyes but led the way. Soon, they reached a small underground pool. The water was crystal clear, reflecting the soft glow of bioluminescent fungi on the walls. Jake knelt beside the pool, cupping his hands to drink. Neri crouched beside him, her own thirst suddenly overwhelming. As she drank, she felt his eyes on her. She hesitated. Slowly, she lifted her gaze. Jake was staring. Not at the water, not at the glowing walls. At her. Her stomach flipped. What? She asked, trying to sound unbothered. Jake grinned. Nothing. Just, you're kinda cute when you're not scowling at me. Neri froze. Her ears burned. Her tail flicked involuntarily. Did he just? Jake's grin widened. What? Did I say something wrong? Neri panicked. She turned away sharply, her thoughts racing. Cute. No one had ever called her that before, and now her brain wouldn't stop thinking about it. Was he flirting with her? No, that was impossible. He was human. He probably didn't mean it that way. Maybe humans just said things like that casually. Maybe she was being ridiculous. And yet, her heart wouldn't calm down. A realization too big to ignore. As they continued forward, Neri found herself acting differently. She walked closer to him than before. Not much, just a little. She found herself noticing things about him. The way he absent-mindedly ran his fingers through his hair. The way his voice softened when he spoke to her. The way his entire body seemed relaxed around her, even though they were still in danger. It made her feel strange. Like maybe she wasn't imagining it. Maybe he did see her. Maybe. No. She shook the thought away. She was being stupid. A Phyloxian and a human. It was impossible. Right? She didn't know anymore. But what she did know was this. She didn't want him to leave. And for the first time in her life, she wished she was bigger, not in size, but in importance. Big enough to be something more to him. The grand challenge. The tunnel stretched on, endless and winding, but Neri no longer paid attention to the darkness around her. Her mind was a battlefield. Jake had called her cute. Cute. She had spent her entire life being invisible, dismissed as weak, unworthy. And now a human, an outsider, someone who didn't belong to her world, had looked at her and seen something different. It made her chest feel tight. She didn't know how to handle it. She had never wanted to be noticed like this before, but now she wanted. And that was the part that scared her the most. A glimpse of light. Hours passed as they moved through the underground labyrinth. Neri guided Jake through narrow corridors, following the old carvings that led to safety. Then, finally, a breakthrough. A soft glow flickered in the distance. Light. Jake let out a breath of relief. That better not be some glowing alien fungus. Neri almost laughed. She hurried ahead, her heart pounding as she climbed toward the light. When she finally reached the top of the path, she gasped. An exit. The underground chamber opened into a cavern, and at the far end, daylight streamed through a cracked ceiling. Jake came up beside her, his blue eyes shining. I could kiss you right now. Neri's brain short-circuited. Jake didn't seem to notice her entire body tensing at his words. He was too busy grinning at the light ahead. Neri forced herself to breathe. He didn't mean it. He was just expressing relief. That was all. Right? Before she could untangle the mess in her mind, a sound echoed through the cavern. Voices. Neri's stomach dropped. And then they appeared. A group of Phyloxian warriors stormed into the cave. The challenge. Jake immediately tensed beside her, his hand instinctively going to his belt, where his weapon would have been if it hadn't been confiscated when he first arrived on this planet. Neri's ears flattened as she recognized the leader of the group. Grusk. Of course. He stood at the front of the warriors, his expression twisted with fury. You. He snarled, eyes locking onto Neri. You dared to walk with an outsider. You dared to disgrace your kind. Neri clenched her fists. I didn't disgrace anyone. Grusk bared his teeth. You led a human through our sacred ruins. You allowed him to step where no outsider should ever step. Jake stepped forward, his voice calm but firm. I don't know what your problem is, but Neri saved my life. Grusk sneered. She is a disgrace, a weakling. She has no place among us. Something inside Neri snapped. She had heard enough. For years, she had let them say these things. For years, she had believed it. But not anymore. She stepped forward. Then prove it. The cavern went dead silent. Jake frowned. Neri. But she didn't look at him. Her eyes were locked on Grusk. I challenge you, she said, her voice steady. A murmur spread through the warriors. Grusk laughed. A cruel, mocking sound. You want to fight me. Neri's heart pounded, but she didn't let fear show. Or are you afraid of losing to someone so small? Grusk's face darkened. Jake stared at her in disbelief. Neri, you don't have to do this. But she did. Because this wasn't just about Grusk. This was about all of them. All the years of being ignored, dismissed, rejected. This was about proving that she wasn't small, not where it mattered. Grusk stepped forward, his massive form towering over her. "Fine," he growled. "You want to fight? Then I'll crush you. A fight of minds, not strength." The warriors circled around them, forming a ring in the cavern. Neri could hear Jake muttering curses behind her. "You don't have to do this," he said again. Neri took a deep breath. "Yes, I do." Grusk lunged. Neri dodged. She wasn't fast. She was lightning. Grusk's massive fist slammed into the ground where she had been standing just a second ago. Dust exploded into the air. Neri moved before he could react. She slid between his legs, using her small size to her advantage. The warriors around them gasped. Jake let out a low whistle. "Okay, that was impressive." Grusk snarled. He swung again, but Neri wasn't where he expected. He was strong, powerful, but he was also slow. And Neri, she had never relied on strength. She used her speed, her intelligence, her precision. Step by step, she led Grusk into his own exhaustion, until finally, he made a mistake. He stumbled. Neri struck. She leaped onto his back, twisting his arm at an angle he couldn't recover from. He hit the ground with a heavy thud. Silence. And then, cheering. The warriors who had once mocked her were now staring in shock. Grusk lay motionless, breathing heavily. She had won. Jake's voice was full of awe. "Dan, Neri." She turned to face him. His eyes were brighter than before. He looked at her like she was something incredible. Her heart stumbled. Then, Grusk's weak voice broke the moment. "You cheated." Neri lifted her chin. "I won." Grusk scowled, but the warriors nodded. One stepped forward. "She fought with honor." Another, "She is worthy." And then, to her absolute shock, they bowed. Jake smirked. "Looks like you're not so small anymore." Neri exhaled. She had done it. For the first time in her life, she was seen. But as she locked eyes with Jake, she realized she wanted to be seen by him the most. And that terrified her. Love is more than size. Neri stood at the center of the cavern, her chest rising and falling as she caught her breath. The weight of what had just happened pressed down on her, heavier than Grusk's massive form lying in defeat behind her. She had won. Not just the fight, but everything. For years, she had been overlooked, dismissed as weak, as unworthy. But now, the warriors who once mocked her were bowing their heads in respect. It didn't feel real. But the warmth in her chest, the way her hands trembled, not from fear, but from victory, told her it was. And then, there was him, Jake, standing just outside the circle of warriors, watching her with a look she couldn't decipher. She swallowed hard. She had spent years dreaming of this moment, of proving herself, of making them see her. So why was Jake's gaze the only one she cared about? The aftermath of victory. The warriors dispersed after the challenge, murmuring among themselves. Even Grusk, humiliated and angry, could say nothing. She had bested him in front of everyone. Jake was still watching her. Neri turned, forcing herself to move toward him, though her heart hammered in her chest. Jake gave her a slow grin, his blue eyes glinting. "You're full of surprises, short stuff." She scowled at him. "Don't call me that." "Why not?" His smirk widened. "It's cute." Her ears burned. There it was again. That word. Cute. She had spent her life wishing to be seen as strong, powerful, respected. But now, with the way Jake was looking at her, something inside her twisted in a way she didn't understand. Did he really see her that way? No, he couldn't. He was human. And she was small. Her heart clenched. She should feel proud right now. But instead, she felt small in a different way. Not because of her size, because suddenly she wanted something she couldn't have. She shook the thought away. "We should go." The exit is near. Jake watched her for a moment longer, as if he could hear everything she wasn't saying. Then he nodded. They'd walked in silence, under the twin moons. By the time they emerged from the underground ruins, the twin moons of Neri's homeworld had risen high into the sky. The cold night air wrapped around her like a whisper, a stark contrast to the heat swirling inside her. Jake let out a long breath, tilting his head up. Never thought I'd be so happy to see the sky again. Neri barely heard him. Her mind was a storm. This was it. This was where they would part ways. The human delegation had their own ship. They would return to their people. And Neri, she would stay behind, like she always had. Jake would leave. And this, whatever this was between them, would disappear. Her chest ached. She had spent her life dreaming of being accepted. And now, just when she had finally been seen, it was about to be ripped away. She clenched her fists. Would he even remember her? Would she just become some alien girl he once met? Neri hated how much that thought hurt. Jake sighed. Guess this is where we say goodbye. Her breath caught. It was happening. He turned to her, rubbing the back of his neck. You know, I kinda wish we had more time. You're different from what I expected. Neri swallowed hard. Different. His gaze softened. I mean that in a good way. She felt her pulse in her throat. Oh. Silence stretched between them. The cool wind stirred around them, carrying the scent of distant flowers. Jake shifted, his voice quieter now. I meant what I said before. Neri blinked. What? That you're cute. Her heart stopped. She stared at him, stunned into silence. Jake chuckled, running a hand through his hair. You don't believe me, do you? Neri's voice felt stuck in her throat. I've never been called that before. His expression turned serious. Why not? She hesitated. Because I'm too small. Because I'm not like the others. Because no one has ever looked at me the way you do. But she couldn't say any of that. Instead, she whispered, because no one has ever seen me like that. Jake's gaze didn't waver. Then, slowly, he stepped closer. Neri's breath hitched. She should step back. She should say something. But she couldn't move. Because for the first time in her life, she didn't want to run. She wanted to stay. Jake's voice was quiet. Well, they were wrong. Neri's chest tightened. Was this really happening? Was she imagining this? But then, Jake reached out, hesitating for just a moment before gently cupping her cheek. His hand was warm, steady. And then, he leaned in. Neri felt like the world stopped. She didn't know how to process this. All she knew was that her eyes fluttered closed, and her heart was no longer her own. Then, soft lips brushed against hers. It was light. Barely there, but it was real. When he pulled away, Neri was speechless. Jake smiled softly. Still think you're too small for love. A single breath escaped her. A whisper. A truth she had never let herself believe. Not anymore. Jake grinned. Good. And this time, when he kissed her again, she kissed him back. Because love. Love was never about size. And for the first time in her life, Neri felt big. Big in all the ways that mattered.